February 8, 1983. A plumber named Mike Catron knelt beside a manhole cover on Cranley Gardens in North London, preparing for what he assumed would be a routine blockage. The residents had complained for weeks that their toilets wouldn't flush, that strange smells were coming from the drains. Mike had seen it all before. Tree roots, nappies, cooking grease, nothing surprising. He lifted the cover, shone his torch down into the pipe, and froze. What floated in the stagnant water below wasn't a blockage. It was flesh, human flesh. Chunks of pale, decomposing tissue mixed with fragments of bone. Mike stumbled backward, his torch clattering to the pavement. He'd been a plumber for 23 years, but nothing in his career had prepared him for this. Within hours, police cars lined the quiet suburban street, and detectives were knocking on every door in the building. One of those doors belongs to flat 23, top floor. The man who answered was polite, softly spoken, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a knitted cardigan. His name was Dennis Nilsen. He was 37 years old, a civil servant working for the Department of Employment. And for the past 5 years, he'd been murdering young men, storing their bodies in his flat, and when that became impossible, dismembering them and flushing the pieces down the toilet. 15 men had walked into Dennis Nilsen's home. None of them walked out alive. If stories like this grip you, hit subscribe and write in the comments, could your neighbor be hiding something like this? Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand how a man becomes capable of such horror, we need to travel back to 1945, to a small fishing town on the northeast coast of Scotland, where a boy named Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born into a family that would never quite know what to do with him. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, a windswept Scottish town where the North Sea crashes against grey stone harbours and everyone knows everyone else's business. His mother, Betty, was a young woman who'd married too quickly during the war. His father, Olav Nilsen, was a Norwegian soldier who drank too much and cared too little. By the time Dennis was 4, his father had abandoned the family entirely, leaving Betty to raise 3 children alone in her parents' cramped cottage. The only person who showed Dennis real affection was his grandfather, Andrew White, a fisherman who took the boy out to the docks and told him stories about the sea. Dennis worshipped him. In a house full of silence and resentment, his grandfather was the only one who made him feel like he mattered. Then, in 1951, when Dennis was just 6 years old, his grandfather died. Betty decided the boy should see the body. She took Dennis into the front room, where his grandfather lay in an open coffin, hands folded across his chest, face waxy and still. No one explained what had happened. No one prepared him. Dennis stood there, staring at the only person who'd ever loved him, now cold and lifeless, like a wax figure in a museum. "Your grandfather has gone away," Betty said quietly, her voice flat. Dennis didn't understand. Gone away where? Why wasn't he moving? Why did he look like that? The adults filed out of the room, leaving Dennis alone with the corpse. And in that moment, something inside the boy's mind twisted. Death became confused with love. Possession became connection. His psychologist would later say, that moment fixated him on death and possession. The only person who showed him affection was now a body, an object that couldn't leave. From that day forward, Dennis withdrew. He stopped speaking much at school. He spent hours alone, watching other children play, but never joining in. Teachers described him as odd but polite. His mother remarried when he was 8 to a man named Adam Scott, who brought more children into an already overcrowded home. Dennis felt even more invisible. By his teenage years, Dennis had realized something else about himself. He was attracted to men. In 1960s Scotland, this wasn't just taboo, it was criminal. Homosexuality was illegal. If anyone found out, his life would be destroyed. So he buried it, never telling a soul, never acting on his feelings, just watching and wanting from a distance. "I fancied a boy at school once," Dennis would later tell police during his confession. "I never said anything, I just watched him. I imagined what it would be like if he stayed with me forever, if he couldn't leave." Living bodies always disappointed him because they had the freedom to leave. December 30th, 1978, Dennis Nilsen had just turned 33. He'd spent years building what looked like a perfectly normal life. He joined the army at 15, served as a cook, then became a police officer for a brief period before settling into a job as a civil servant at the job centre in Kentish Town. He lived alone in a garden flat at 195 Melrose Avenue in Crickwood, North London. To his colleagues, he was quiet, competent, occasionally odd, but harmless. What they didn't know was that Dennis spent most evenings alone, drinking cheap rum and listening to music in a flat that felt emptier with each passing year. He'd tried relationships, they never lasted. Men would stay for a night or two, then leave, and every time they left, the loneliness became more unbearable. That night, Dennis walked into the Crickwood Arms, a local pub near his flat. It was crowded, loud, full of people celebrating the end of the year. And sitting alone at the bar was a teenage boy with dark hair and nervous eyes. His name was Stephen Holmes. He was 14 years old, though he looked older. He'd run away from a children's home and had nowhere to go. Dennis sat down beside him and ordered a drink. "Cold night," Dennis said, his voice soft and friendly. Stephen nodded, grateful for the warmth, grateful someone was talking to him. "Fancy a drink at my place?" Dennis asked. "It's just around the corner. I've got music, food. You look like you could use somewhere warm to sleep." Stephen hesitated, but only for a moment. The man seemed kind, safe, and it was freezing outside. "Yeah, all right," Stephen said. They walked back to Melrose Avenue together. Dennis unlocked the door to his flat, switched on the lights, and poured them both drinks, rum and coke. Stephen drank quickly, the alcohol warming him from the inside. They talked for a while, music playing in the background. Then Stephen fell asleep on the sofa. When he woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the curtains. Stephen sat up, rubbing his eyes. "I should get going," he said, standing and reaching for his jacket. And in that moment, Dennis felt it. The panic, the fear, the unbearable thought of being alone again. No, not yet. Dennis moved quickly. He grabbed one of his neckties from the back of a chair and wrapped it around Stephen's neck from behind. Stephen clawed at the fabric, gasping, his feet kicking against the floor. Dennis pulled tighter, his face blank, his hands steady. After what felt like an eternity, Stephen stopped moving. But Dennis didn't stop. He carried the boy's body to the bathroom, filled a bucket with water, and held Stephen's head under until he was certain, absolutely certain. Then he carried Stephen to the bedroom, undressed him, washed the body carefully, and laid him on the bed. Dennis climbed in beside him, wrapping his arms around the corpse. "You won't leave now." For the next 7 months, Dennis kept Stephen's body in the flat. He stored it under the floorboards during the day, then pulled it out at night to sit with, to talk to watch television beside. He took photographs. He arranged the limbs in different positions. And when the decomposition became too advanced, when the smell became impossible to ignore, he finally dismembered the body and burned the pieces in the garden, building a bonfire and placing a car tire on top to mask the smell of burning flesh. He had discovered something. The dead couldn't leave him. The killing had unlocked something in Dennis Nilsen, a need that couldn't be satisfied, only temporarily quieted. Over the next 3 years, more young men disappeared into 195 Melrose Avenue. Dennis developed a pattern. He'd find them in pubs, on the streets, at bus stops. Always the vulnerable ones. Homeless men, drifters, runaways. Men who wouldn't be missed immediately, whose absence wouldn't trigger alarm bells. Kenneth Ockenden was 23 years old, a Canadian tourist visiting London in December 1979. He met Dennis in a pub, and Dennis offered to show him the city. They spent the day sightseeing, laughing, taking photographs together. That night, back at Melrose Avenue, Dennis strangled Kenneth with the cord from his own headphones while Kenneth was listening to music. He kept Kenneth's body for several weeks, dressing it in different clothes, positioning it in chairs around the flat like a life-size doll. Martin Duffy was 16, a homeless boy from Birkenhead who'd come to London looking for work. He met Dennis at a train station in May 1980. Dennis brought him home, gave him food and alcohol, then drowned him in the kitchen sink while Martin was too drunk to fight back. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. would later say during the investigation, "These boys trusted him. They saw a kind face, someone offering help. They never saw the monster underneath." At one point, Dennis had 3 bodies stored in different rooms. Under the floorboards in the bedroom, inside a wardrobe, wrapped in plastic bags in the bathroom. Neighbors began complaining about the smell. Dennis told them it was blocked drains, rotting food, a dead animal under the house. He sprayed air freshener constantly. He burned incense. And when the decomposition became too severe, he dismembered the bodies in his bathtub, packed the pieces into suitcases, and burned them in bonfires in the back garden. Malcolm Barlow was 23 years old, suffering from epilepsy, collapsed outside Dennis's flat in September 1981. Dennis called an ambulance, played the concerned neighbor. The next day, Malcolm came back to thank him. "You saved my life," Malcolm said at the door, smiling gratefully. Dennis invited him in for tea. That night, he strangled Malcolm on the floor of his living room. "Easiest kill of all," Dennis would later tell police. "He trusted me completely." Not every victim died. In November 1980, a man named Carl Stotter woke up in Dennis's bathtub, water closing over his head, Dennis's hands holding him under. Carl thrashed, fighting for his life. And suddenly, inexplicably, Dennis pulled him out, revived him, put him to bed, and let him leave the next morning. Carl remembered nothing clearly, thought he'd had some kind of accident. He didn't report it. He had no idea how close he'd come to becoming another body under the floorboards. By 1981, Dennis Nilsen had murdered at least 12 men. Then his landlord informed him the house was being sold. Dennis would have to move. He found a new flat, flat 23, at 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill. It was smaller, cleaner, on the top floor of a converted house. There was no garden this time, no floorboards thick enough to hide bodies. Just a toilet, a bathtub, and thin walls. But Dennis Nilsen couldn't stop killing, so he adapted. January 26, 1983. Dennis Nilsen sat in his flat at Cranley Gardens, a glass of rum in one hand, watching the body of Stephen Sinclair decompose on his bedroom floor. Stephen was 20 years old, a homeless drifter Dennis had met near a Leicester Square burger bar just days earlier. He'd strangled him with a tie, same method as always. But this time, disposal was proving impossible. No garden, no floorboards, just a small top-floor flat with thin walls and neighbors on every side. Dennis had tried boiling the head in a large cooking pot on his stove, hoping to strip the flesh from the skull so he could dispose of it more easily. The smell was overwhelming, putrid. He opened the windows, but it didn't help. Then he began the dismemberment, working methodically in his bathtub with a kitchen knife, cutting the body into smaller pieces, bagging them, and flushing what he could down the toilet. For weeks he'd been doing this, piece by piece, limb by limb. The drains couldn't handle it. February 8th, Mike Catron, the plumber, made his discovery. By that evening, Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. was standing outside Flat 23 with a search warrant and 3 other officers. Dennis answered the door calmly, still wearing his work clothes from the job center. "Mr. Nilsen?" Jay asked. "Yes. We'd like to speak with you about the drains." Dennis nodded, stepped aside, let them in. The moment they entered, the smell hit them. Sweet, rotten, unmistakable. One officer covered his mouth. "What's that smell?" Jay asked, his eyes scanning the small flat. Dennis looked at him for a long moment, then spoke quietly. "What you're looking for is in plastic bags around the flat." They found 2 black bin bags in the wardrobe containing human remains, a torso in the bathtub, more bags in the cupboard under the sink. Detectives later estimated there were parts from at least 3 different bodies scattered throughout the flat. At Hornsey Police Station, Dennis Nilsen confessed for 12 hours straight. He sat across from detectives, speaking in a calm, measured voice, as if he were describing his daily commute rather than a 5-year killing spree. "How many?" Detective J asked. Dennis paused, calculating. 15, maybe 16. I've lost count." "Why did you kill them?" "They almost always got in," Dennis said simply. "Trust made them vulnerable." He provided names when he could remember them: Stephen Holmes, Kenneth Ockenden, Martin Duffy, Malcolm Barlow. He described the methods: strangulation, drowning, always when they were asleep or too drunk to fight. He explained how he'd kept the bodies, how he'd talked to them, bathed them, arranged them like companions, how he'd eventually burned or dismembered them when storage became impossible. The trial began on October 24, 1983, at the Old Bailey. Dennis's defense team argued he was insane, suffering from a personality disorder that prevented him from understanding right from wrong. The prosecution argued he was a cold, calculated killer who knew exactly what he was doing. They pointed to the planning, the disposal methods, the fact that he went to work every day and functioned normally in society. Prosecutor Alan Green read portions of Dennis's confession to the jury for 4 hours. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the full horror unfolded. Family members of the victims wept. Others simply stared at Dennis, trying to understand how this ordinary-looking man could have done such things. On November 4, 1983, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty of 6 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder. Mr. Justice Croom Johnson sentenced Dennis Nilsen to life imprisonment, with a recommendation he serve a minimum of 25 years. As guards led him from the courtroom, Dennis showed no emotion. He didn't cry. He didn't apologize. He simply walked away, disappearing into the prison system where he would spend the rest of his life. Dennis Nilsen spent 34 years behind bars. He was held in various prisons, eventually settling into HMP Full Sutton in Yorkshire, a high-security facility housing some of Britain's most dangerous criminals. He filled his time writing thousands of pages of autobiography, journals, letters to journalists and researchers. The prison service refused to publish any of it, deeming it too graphic and self-serving. Carl Stotter, the man who survived Dennis's attempt to drown him, gave testimony that helped secure the conviction. Decades later, he told reporters, "I wake up every night feeling that tie around my neck. I see his face looking down at me in that bathtub. I survived, but I never really escaped." The mother of Stephen Holmes, Dennis's first victim, spoke at a victim's memorial service in 2006. "We never got to bury him whole," she said, her voice breaking. "We never got to say goodbye properly. That monster took everything from us, even the chance to mourn with dignity." On May 12, 2018, Dennis Nilsen died in his cell at HMP Full Sutton. He was 72 years old. He'd suffered a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm and died in excruciating pain, alone, just as his victims had died alone. A post-mortem inquest later revealed he'd been lying in agony for hours before anyone found him. There were no mourners at his funeral, no family members. His ashes were scattered at sea with no ceremony. 15 men are still dead. Their names deserve to be remembered. Stephen Holmes, 14. Kenneth Ockenden, 23. Martin Duffy, 16. Malcolm Barlow, 23. John Howlett, 23. Graham Allen, 27, Stephen Sinclair, 20, and 8 others whose names Dennis could never quite recall, whose identities remain uncertain, whose families may still be waiting for answers that will never come. The danger was never the stranger in the dark alley. It was the familiar face at the door, the kind voice offering shelter, the polite civil servant who seemed so utterly, devastatingly normal. Dennis Nilsen proved that evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It knocks quietly, smiles politely, and waits for you to let it in.